The black woman almost rode past the ranch, until she saw what was growing beside the dead Wyoming dirt. Snow cracked under the cattle's hooves as Cole Mercer dropped to one knee in the ruined flower field, his hand wrapped around crushed blue petals, stained dark with mud. Across the broken fence, Evelyn could still hear men shouting through the wind, but Cole never looked at them. He just stared at the flowers like he'd lost something alive. And that was the moment she realized the quiet cowboy hiding in these mountains carried a story nobody in Red Hollow truly knew. If you're watching tonight, tell me where you're listening from. By the time Evelyn Brooks crossed into Wyoming territory, the inside of her mouth tasted like dust and old coffee. The road north of Cheyenne had narrowed into wagon ruts baked hard beneath the July sun. Dry wind rolled across the open land in long, restless breaths, carrying the smell of sagebrush and hot earth. Copper moved steadily beneath her, old but dependable, his ears twitching, every now and then at flies that refused to leave either of them alone. She had been traveling for 6 days, 2 dresses, 1 wooden trunk tied behind the saddle, 3 account books wrapped in cloth, and $32 sewn into the lining of her coat because her father had once told her banks could fail faster than honest hands ever did. The school in Missouri had closed in April after funding disappeared and half the town moved west looking for railroad work. Evelyn stayed as long as she could. Then one morning she packed her things, locked the classroom door behind her, and never went back. By late afternoon, the Wyoming heat had settled low and heavy across the valley. Ranch after ranch passed by in shades of brown and gray, lean cattle, dry fences, empty water barrels beside barns weathered silver from wind. Nothing surprised her anymore. Until she saw the flowers. Copper slowed before she even pulled the reins. At first, Evelyn thought she imagined them. The color looked wrong against the land itself, too alive. Then she reached the ridge overlooking the valley floor and saw them properly. Wildflowers stretched along a split-rail fence beneath the shadow of distant mountains. Thick bands of orange Indian paintbrush, purple lupine, yellow prairie sunflowers bending softly in the wind. Not scattered patches, not neglected weeds. Someone had planted them carefully. The sight caught somewhere deep inside her chest. She sat there for several seconds without moving. The ranch behind the flowers was modest. 1 barn, 1 windmill, a small house with a covered porch. Smoke drifted lazily from a stovepipe near the back. Everything around it looked ordinary. Everything except the flowers. Evelyn finally guided Copper down the slope toward the gate. She told herself she needed water. That was true, but not true enough. The ranch yard sat quiet beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere nearby, she heard the steady knock of metal against wood. A dog lifted its head beneath the porch, watched her calmly, then settled back down without barking. She dismounted slowly, boots crunching against dry dirt. The sound came again, a hammer this time. She followed it, around the side of the barn. The man repairing the fence looked up before she spoke, as if he'd sensed someone standing there. He was taller than she'd expected. Broad shoulders beneath a faded denim shirt rolled to the elbows. Dark hair touched with sun at the edges. His hands moved with the easy certainty of somebody who had spent years building the same life piece by piece. He rested the hammer against the fence post. "Afternoon," he said. His voice carried no surprise, no suspicion either, just caution worn smooth by habit. "Afternoon," Evelyn answered. "I hope I'm not intruding. My horse could use water." He glanced toward Copper. "So could you." It wasn't flirtation, just observation. He nodded toward the east side of the barn. "Pumps still working, troughs clean. Thank you." She followed him around the barn. Up close, she noticed details she hadn't from the ridge. Dirt beneath his fingernails, faint lines near his eyes from years of sun, a healing scrape across one knuckle. The pump handle groaned softly as he worked it. Cold water splashed into the trough. Copper lowered his head immediately and drank deep. Evelyn cupped water into her hands and drank beside him. It tasted sharp and cold from deep underground. For a moment neither spoke. Wind moved through the flower field beyond the fence with a soft rustling sound almost like rain. "You planted all those?" she finally asked. He glanced toward the flowers. "Most of them. They don't look wild. Some are." He wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his back pocket. "Some just learned how to survive here." She looked out at the color spilling across the dry valley. No ranch she had passed looked anything like this. "Why flowers?" she asked. He stayed quiet long enough that she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then he rested one arm against the fence rail and looked toward the field behind the barn. "Because hard land changes men if they got nothing soft left to look at." The words settled between them quietly. No performance in them, no attempt to sound wise. Just something true he had already lived with a long time. Evelyn studied him more carefully then. "Evelyn Brooks," she said. "Cole Mercer." She nodded once. The dog wandered over at last, old and brown around the muzzle. Cole scratched behind its ear absent-mindedly. "Town's another 6 miles north," he said. "Red Hollow. That's where I'm headed. Work? Bookkeeping." He gave a small nod like that made sense. "You're late getting there before dark." "I know." He glanced toward the mountains where shadows had already started slipping into the valley. "You can cut west at the creek bed," he said. "Roads shorter, less rock for your horse." She thanked him. Then she stood there, a second longer than necessary. The flowers moved gently in the wind behind him. And for reasons she didn't entirely understand, she suddenly felt very tired of leaving places. By the time Evelyn reached Red Hollow, dusk had settled blue across the town. The boarding house smelled like stew and coal smoke. Wagons rattled somewhere outside. Piano music drifted faintly from the saloon down the street. Mrs. Harper, the widow who rented her the upstairs room, handed her a key and a chipped wash basin. "You came from Missouri alone?" the woman asked. "Yes, Mom." Mrs. Harper looked impressed by that in the quiet way practical women sometimes did. Later that night, Evelyn sat near the small window of her room in her stocking feet, ledger books stacked beside the bed. The town outside slowly quieted, but sleep never really came. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flowers moving against dry Wyoming wind. The next morning, she went downstairs for coffee before sunrise. 2 ranch hands sat near the stove, talking low over biscuits and bacon grease. One of them laughed suddenly. "You pass Mercer's place coming in?" The other snorted. "Hard not to. Fools growing flowers where cattle ought to be. Mercer's the strangest rancher in the territory. That man plants flowers where cattle should be." They laughed again. Evelyn lowered her coffee cup slowly. Then she looked out the window toward the pale morning hills beyond Red Hollow. And for the first time since leaving Missouri, she found herself wanting very badly to know what waited somewhere beyond the next ridge. Red Hollow woke early. By 6 o'clock, the boardwalk outside the freight office already carried the sound of boots, wagon wheels, and men arguing about cattle prices over burnt coffee. Dust drifted through town before noon most days. By afternoon, it settled into cuffs, coat hems, and the corners of ledger pages. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the place quickly. The freight office sat beside the general supply store near the center of town. Barrels of nails and lamp oil lined the front porch. Crates stamped with railroad markings waited near the loading dock. Inside, the office smelled like ink, canvas, tobacco, and old paper warmed by sun through dirty windows. Mr. Talbot, the owner, handed her 3 months of tangled invoices her first morning. "If you can make sense of that mess," he said, "I'll consider it a miracle." By Thursday, she had balanced every shipment record down to the cent. Men who came into the office started pausing when they saw her, working. Not because she was slow, because she wasn't. She kept her sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, while figures moved steadily beneath her pencil. Freight weights, water taxes, feed receipts, land filings. She checked numbers twice and remembered them afterward. By the second week, ranchers had started asking for her directly. Miss Brooks still here. She the one handles contracts. She reads legal filings too, most asked politely. Some didn't. One afternoon, a broad man named Clyde Granger stepped into the office carrying mud on his boots and impatience on his face. Evelyn recognized him immediately. Men like Clyde existed in every territory. Expensive coat, silver watch chain, voice too loud indoors. He tossed a folded receipt onto her desk. Your freight numbers are wrong. She unfolded the paper calmly. They aren't. His eyes narrowed slightly at that. You checked already? Yes, you check again. She did, slowly, without hurrying for him. Finally, she turned the ledger around and tapped the final column with her pencil. You were charged for 6 crates of fencing wire, she said. Not 5. Your foreman signed for all 6 3 days ago. Clyde stared at the page for several seconds. Then he looked at her. Most women in town lowered their eyes when he did that. Evelyn didn't. Something shifted in his expression after that. Not respect exactly. Recognition, maybe. Well, he muttered, guess your books know more than my foreman. When he left, Mr. Talbot leaned against the doorway, chewing tobacco thoughtfully. You got steadier nerves than most men I hire. My father used to say numbers don't care who gets angry at them. That almost made him laugh. Sunday arrived with cooler air rolling down from the mountains. Evelyn told herself she only meant to ride outside town for fresh air. Copper carried her south along the valley road anyway, past dry pasture land, past a creek bed lined with cottonwoods, past miles of open Wyoming sky stretched pale and endless above the hills. Then finally the flowers appeared again beside the fence line. This time she noticed more of them. White evening primrose near the creek, bright orange paintbrush clustered beside weathered posts, purple blooms she didn't know the names of yet. Cole Mercer was repairing a gate when she rode in. He looked up once. No surprise crossed his face, almost like he'd expected her eventually. Afternoon, he said. Afternoon. You exercising the horse again? There was something dry in his voice now. Not teasing exactly. Close enough to it. She slid down from the saddle. Maybe. The corner of his mouth moved slightly before he looked back at the gate hinge. She stayed most of the afternoon. Not because either of them asked her to. It simply happened that way. Cole fixed fencing while she sat on the porch rail, drinking coffee from a dented tin cup. The dog slept beneath her boots in strips of sunlight. Wind moved softly through the flowers beyond the barn. He spoke more when they were working beside each other. Not long speeches, small things. Which flowers survived, frost better. Why horses disliked sudden mountain thunder. How creek water turned bitter late in August if the summer stayed too dry. And through all of it, he never once asked why she had left Missouri. Never asked why she came west alone. Never asked the kind of careful questions people usually wrapped around judgment. By the time the sun dropped low behind the hills, Evelyn realized how unusual that felt. That evening, snow arrived early over Red Hollow. Thin white flakes drifted beneath the street lamps, while church supper emptied onto the boardwalks in noisy groups. Cole appeared beside her outside the church doors while she buttoned her coat. I'll walk you back. You don't have to. I know. They walked through town slowly beneath the falling snow. Somewhere a piano played through the saloon walls. Horses stamped inside the livery barn. Light spilled gold across the frozen mud streets. At her boarding house steps, she stopped and turned toward him. Snow had settled lightly across his shoulders. You don't ask many questions, she said quietly. Cole looked at her for a long second before answering. You don't have to explain yourself every time you walk into a room. Something tightened unexpectedly in her throat. He tipped his hat once and stepped back into the snow before she could think of a reply. Evelyn stayed on the porch long after he disappeared down the street. 3 days later, she overheard 2 men talking outside the bank while delivering invoices. Mercer's behind again. Bank gave him till spring. That ranch won't survive another bad season. Evelyn slowed without meaning to. Behind the dusty office glass, she saw Cole standing at the teller counter, hat in his hands, shoulders still and straight, while the banker spoke quietly across from him. For the first time since meeting him, she noticed how worn his coat cuffs really were. That night, the saloon filled early because of the cold. Evelyn had only gone inside to deliver corrected freight papers to Mr. Talbot. Clyde Granger stood near the bar with 3 cattlemen gathered around him. Conversation quieted slightly when she entered. Clyde lifted his whiskey glass toward the window where snow drifted outside. "Flowers don't belong on cattle land," he said loudly. A few men chuckled. Then his eyes moved toward Evelyn. "Neither do fantasies." The room went still after that. Not hostile, worse, careful. Evelyn held his stare only a second before setting the freight papers onto the counter. Then she turned and walked back out into the falling snow, with her spine straight and her gloves clenched tight in one hand. Behind her, the saloon doors swung shut hard against the winter wind. The storm arrived 3 nights later. People in Red Hollow had been talking about it since morning. Ranch hands hurried feed sacks into barns. Storefronts nailed shutters closed before sunset. By supper time, the sky had turned the color of old iron over the mountains. Evelyn finished balancing freight invoices by lamplight while snow tapped softly against the office windows. "Mr. Talbot looked outside once and muttered, 'That one's coming in mean.' He wasn't wrong. By the time Evelyn saddled Copper behind the boarding house, the wind had already started pushing snow sideways across the street. Visibility dropped fast. The church steeple disappeared first. Then the livery stable. She should have stayed in town. She knew that. But all afternoon she'd kept thinking about the Mercer Ranch sitting alone at the edge of the valley beneath that wide Wyoming sky. And somehow that thought had become stronger than caution. The ride south turned ugly within an hour. Snow packed itself into Copper's mane and against Evelyn's coat collar. Wind tore through the valley hard enough to sting her face raw. The road vanished twice beneath drifting snow. When she finally saw the lantern hanging outside Cole's barn, relief hit her so suddenly she almost laughed. Cole came out of the barn before she reached the gate. For one sharp second, his expression changed completely when he recognized her through the storm. Not annoyance, fear. He grabbed Copper's reins immediately. "You rode through this? I thought I could make it before." "You couldn't." The words came harder than usual from him. Then he looked at her again. Slower this time, taking in the snow frozen along her sleeves. "Come inside before you freeze." The house smelled like coffee, cedar smoke, and damp wool drying near the stove. Cole hung her coat beside the fire without ceremony, while she warmed stiff hands around a tin mug he placed in front of her. Outside, the storm rattled the windows hard enough to shake the lamp flames. "You always ignore weather warnings?" he asked. "Only the dramatic ones." That almost earned a smile. Almost. The storm trapped them there 4 days. By the second morning, the ranch had disappeared beneath waist-high drifts. Wind screamed across the valley all night long, like something alive out beyond the fences. And slowly, quietly, the house settled around them. Cole woke before dawn every morning to build the fire. Evelyn would come downstairs, wrapped in a wool blanket, and find coffee already waiting beside the stove. Sometimes he cooked eggs, sometimes biscuits. Once he burned bacon badly enough that even the old dog refused it. She laughed so hard at his expression, he threatened to throw the pan into the snow. The ranch books sat stacked beside the kitchen table, and by the 3rd day, Evelyn had organized nearly 6 months of feed receipts and cattle records into proper ledgers. "You keep records like a gambler," she told him one evening. Cole leaned back in his chair. "That bad? That dangerous?" A quiet chuckle escaped him then. It changed his whole face. At night they read in the same room while wind battered the house outside. Cole preferred history books and old trail journals. Evelyn read novels beside the fire, with one stock-inged foot tucked beneath her. Sometimes neither spoke for an hour. The silence never felt uncomfortable. One afternoon she wandered into the old storage barn, searching for lamp oil, and found a wooden crate beneath a canvas tarp. Inside sat dozens of seed packets tied carefully with twine. Lupine, prairie rose, blue flax. Beneath them rested a faded cream-colored scarf, folded with almost painful neatness, and several letters bound together by ribbon. Cole stood in the doorway before she realized he'd followed her. Snowlight drifted through the cracks in the barn walls between them. "She died before reaching Wyoming," he said quietly. Evelyn didn't touch the letters. "Your wife?" He shook his head once. "We were engaged." The barn stayed very still except for wind outside. She got sick crossing Nebraska. Fever, mostly. His jaw tightened faintly. By the time I reached her, she was already gone. Evelyn looked down at the packets of flower seeds. "And after that?" Cole's eyes drifted toward the storm outside the barn doors. "After that, I stopped building things for a while." His voice carried no drama, no self-pity, which somehow made it sadder. "Then one spring I planted flowers because the place felt—" He searched briefly for the word. "Dead inside." Evelyn looked at him a long moment after that. Then, very carefully, she folded the scarf again exactly the way she'd found it. That night, the storm softened for the first time. Snow slid quietly from the roof outside the bedroom windows. Firelight moved gold across the kitchen walls while Cole repaired a broken bridle strap near the stove. Evelyn stood beside the window, watching snow drift gently across the flower field buried beneath white. "You loved her very much," she said softly. Cole's hands stilled against the leather. "Yes." The honesty of it settled warmly inside her instead of hurting. After a moment, she crossed the room. He looked up just as she touched his face. The kiss wasn't desperate, wasn't rushed, just slow and certain and warm, in the middle of a Wyoming winter that suddenly felt less lonely than either of them remembered. When they pulled apart, Cole rested his forehead briefly against hers, without speaking. Outside, the storm finally began to pass. The next morning, shouting woke them before sunrise. Cole was already pulling on his boots when he heard it again. Cattle, too many, running hard. They burst outside into bitter cold wind and found the north fence smashed open. A herd had torn through the flower field during the night. Snow and crushed color covered the ground together. Broken stems lay flattened beneath muddy hoofprints. Orange petals scattered across the white drifts like spilled paint. Cole stopped moving. Evelyn had never seen anger settle into someone so quietly. He walked into the ruined field without speaking, bent once to lift a crushed bundle of blue flax from the snow. His jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the winter stubble. "Clyde," he said finally, not loud. "Certain." Then, Evelyn noticed something else near the broken fence post. Paper, half buried beneath snow. She picked it up carefully. A folded survey document stamped with county markings, and at the bottom, beneath fresh ink and water boundary sketches, she saw Clyde Granger's signature, beside altered land lines surrounding the North Spring near Mercer Ranch. Evelyn looked up slowly toward Cole. Snow drifted between them in cold morning wind. "He's trying to take your water rights," she said. Cole took the paper from her slowly. His eyes moved once across the altered survey lines, then again, longer this time. The North Spring sat at the edge of his property near the cottonwoods. In dry years, it kept half the ranch alive. Without it, cattle wouldn't last through August. "He can't file this legally," Evelyn said. Cole folded the document carefully instead of crushing it. "That's never stopped men before." The storm cleared by afternoon, leaving the valley buried beneath sharp white light. Snow clung to fence posts and rooftops while cold wind swept long trails across the open land. They spent the next 2 days repairing damage. Cole worked mostly in silence, not angry silence, focused silence. The kind men carried when they knew resolved very little before winter ended. Evelyn helped rebuild the north fence with numb hands inside, borrowed gloves too large for her wrists. The old dog followed them through the snowdrifts, while Cole hammered rails back into frozen ground. Every so often she caught him glancing toward the ruined flower field. Not mourning it exactly, counting losses maybe. By Friday, she returned to Red Hollow. The town felt different immediately. People still nodded at her on the boardwalks, but conversations paused more often when she walked by. Women at the church bakery table smiled too quickly before looking away. Near the freight office, she overheard two men talking beside a wagon. Mercer's done if Granger gets that spring. Bank'll swallow the ranch by summer. Evelyn kept walking. Inside the office, Mr. Talbot rubbed tired eyes behind his desk. 3 cattle buyers canceled Mercer contracts this morning. She stopped writing. Why? He gave her a long look. Because Clyde Granger asked them to. That evening, she rode south again. Cole sat on the porch steps, sharpening a knife when she arrived. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof beside him. The mountains behind the ranch glowed blue beneath sunset. You should be in town, he said quietly. You say that every time I come here. Maybe because I mean it every time. She dismounted slowly. Cole set the knife aside. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he looked toward the ruined field. If leaving keeps you safe, he said, I'll understand. The words landed heavier than shouting would have. Evelyn studied his face in the fading light. The tiredness beneath his eyes. The stubborn calm he wore like another layer of clothing. You think this is about safety? She asked softly. Cole didn't answer. That bothered her more than if he had. The next morning, she was waiting outside the county land office before sunrise. By noon, her desk held old grant maps, railroad filings, water boundary surveys, tax ledgers, and 20 years of property transfers stacked shoulder high beside the lamp. The clerk stared at her by mid-afternoon. You planning to sleep here? If necessary. For 3 straight nights she worked beneath yellow lamplight while snowmelt dripped outside the courthouse roof. Ink stained her fingertips black. Coffee turned cold beside her elbow untouched. Slowly patterns emerged, a shifted boundary marker here, a rewritten acreage figure there. Then finally she found it. An original territorial map from 1868. The North Spring had always belonged to Mercer land. Clyde Granger's newest filing moved the creek boundary nearly 40 yards west. Illegal, deliberate, careless enough that only someone patient with numbers would notice. Evelyn sat back slowly in her chair. Outside the courthouse windows, dawn had started turning the snow pale gold. By afternoon, the whole valley packed itself into the Red Hollow town hall. Ranchers lined the walls in muddy boots and winter coats, smelling faintly of horses and cold air. Women crowded the back rows, whispering behind gloved hands. Clyde Granger stood near the judge's table, looking entirely confident, until Evelyn walked in carrying 3 ledgers against her chest. Then his smile faded slightly. Cole sat near the rear wall beside the stove, hat turning slowly between rough hands. Evelyn never looked at him directly, not at first. The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours. Clyde talked loudly. Evelyn talked carefully. That turned out stronger. She laid each paper down one by one across the table. Original, survey maps, tax receipts, federal water claims, railroad easement records, every number aligned. Every altered line pointed back toward Granger land. The room grew quieter with each document. Finally, even the judge removed his spectacles and frowned down at the paperwork. These boundaries were changed after county approval, he said sharply. Clyde's jaw tightened. That spring belongs to Mercer Ranch. A murmur rolled through the room. Evelyn sat very still, while men along the walls looked at her differently now. Not warmly, but honestly, like someone who had earned space they could no longer deny. Across the room, she finally met Cole's eyes. He didn't smile, but something inside his face softened with unmistakable pride. The ruling ended before sunset. Granger lost the claim. Outside Town Hall, the snow had begun melting into long silver streams along the muddy street. People spilled onto the boardwalk, talking louder now that the tension had broken. Evelyn stepped beside Cole beneath the awning. "You were right," he said quietly. "So were you." "About what?" "That men try things because they think nobody's paying attention." For the first time all day, a faint smile touched his mouth. Then shouting erupted near the hitching rail. One of Granger's ranch hands shoved through the crowd, drunk on anger and humiliation. Everything happened too fast after that. The man swung once toward Cole from behind. Cole turned just enough for the blow to catch the side of his head instead of the back. He stumbled hard against the wooden courthouse steps and fell into melting snow. The whole street froze. Evelyn dropped beside him instantly. Blood ran dark against the white slush near his temple. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, her hands started shaking. Not from cold. "Cole," she whispered, his eyes opened slowly. Focused on her immediately. "I'm all right," he muttered. But the blood against the snow said otherwise. The doctor from Red Hollow stitched Cole's head, wound that same night beneath the yellow light of Mrs. Harper's parlor lamp. 6 stitches. Strict instructions to rest. Cole ignored the second part immediately. By sunrise, he was already trying to sit up on the boarding house sofa, with one hand pressed against the bandage near his temple. "You're bleeding through it again," Evelyn said. "I've had worse. That doesn't make this good." He looked at her then, really looked, and slowly leaned back against the pillow without another argument. Outside, late winter loosened its grip inch by inch across the valley. Snow slid from rooftops during the afternoons. Mud returned to the streets of Red Hollow. Thin rivers of meltwater cut through wagon ruts along the road south. Evelyn moved into the rhythm of the Mercer ranch almost without deciding to. She handled feed orders from the freight office in town. Balanced accounts late at night beside Cole's kitchen stove. Hired 2 temporary ranch hands after discovering one section of west fencing had nearly collapsed beneath drifting snow. The flower field looked terrible at first. Broken stems, trampled roots, mud where color used to live. One cold morning she stood in the ruined rows holding seed packets against her coat, while wind moved softly through the valley. Cole watched from the porch, one arm still stiff from the fall. "You don't have to fix it," he said quietly. She knelt into the dirt anyway. "I know." That answer stayed with him. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year. The first sign was the creek breaking free of ice near the cottonwoods. Then small patches of green pushing through brown pasture land. Then birds returning to fence rails outside the barn at sunrise. And people started showing up, not dramatically, just quietly. Mrs. Harper arrived first with 2 covered dishes wrapped in towels and enough stew to feed 6 ranch hands. "I made too much," she claimed, which fooled nobody. A young carpenter named Jonah Reed came out 3 days later with fresh cedar posts stacked in his wagon. "Heard your north fence still leans," he muttered toward Cole. "Figured I'd straighten it before cattle got ideas." Then came an older ranch couple carrying coffee tins filled with wildflower seeds. Cole recognized them immediately. 5 years earlier, he'd helped them survive a drought by sharing water access from the North Spring. Neither mentioned that now. The man simply handed over the seeds. Thought these belonged out here. After that, the visits kept happening. A widow with preserves, a ranch hand offering labor, a family bringing spare lumber. No speeches, no apologies, just people slowly stepping closer again. One afternoon, Evelyn sat cross-legged in the field, replanting blue flax beside the creek, while sunlight warmed the back of her neck through her thin work shirt. Her skirt hem was stained red from Wyoming dirt. Loose strands of hair kept blowing across her face. She didn't notice Cole watching her from the porch steps, not until she looked up and found him standing there with his cane forgotten loosely in one hand. The field behind her had started blooming again, not fully, but enough. Small streaks of purple and orange moving softly beneath the spring wind. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Cole walked slowly into the field toward her. "You stayed," he said. The words came rougher than usual, like they'd lived inside him a while before finding air. Evelyn brushed dirt from her hands as she stood. "You sound surprised." "A little." She looked around at the flowers, beginning to return beside the fence line. "At some point," she said softly, "this stopped feeling like your ranch." He understood exactly what she meant. That night they sat together on the porch, beneath a sky crowded thick with stars. The valley smelled like damp earth and cedar smoke drifting from the stove pipe. Somewhere down near the creek, a horse shifted softly in the dark. Cole rested his elbows against his knees while Evelyn wrapped both hands around a warm coffee cup. "There's something I never told you," he said. She waited. "The first day you came here," his gaze drifted toward the ridge above the valley. "I saw you stop your horse before you turned in." Evelyn blinked once. "From the barn." He smiled faintly to himself. "You sat up there a long while." Wind moved softly through the porch rails. "I remember thinking you looked like somebody deciding whether to keep going." She stared out toward the dark hills beyond the ranch. "I almost did. I know." The quiet stretched comfortably between them. Then he looked at her fully. "And when you turned around, I thought—" He hesitated briefly before shaking his head once. "Maybe God finally sent somebody who could see this place the way I do." Something inside Evelyn gave way at those words. Not sharply, gently, like snow finally melting off frozen ground. By late summer, the flower field stretched wider than before. Blue flax near the creek, Indian paintbrush beside the split-rail fence, golden wild sunflowers turning slowly beneath August light. The wedding happened on a warm Sunday evening, with mountains glowing copper behind the valley. Mrs. Harper cried openly before the ceremony even started. Jonah Reed stood near the porch, trying unsuccessfully to look serious. The old dog wandered between guests, accepting scraps from every direction. Evelyn wore a pale blue dress she had altered herself by lamplight over several evenings. Cole looked uncomfortable in his new black coat until she took his hand. Then he stopped noticing the coat entirely. No grand church, no fancy reception. Just Wyoming wind moving through flowers while the sun dropped low behind the hills. Afterward, people stayed late on the porch drinking coffee from mismatched cups while lanterns flickered gold against the dark. Years passed. The ranch grew stronger. So did the flowers. Travelers crossing the valley started using the place as a landmark. Turn left where the flowers grow. Everyone knew exactly what that meant. One June afternoon years later, Evelyn stood on the porch shelling peas into a bowl when she noticed a young black woman on horseback stop near the ridge above the valley. The rider sat there silently, looking down at the flower field, moving bright beneath summer wind, just staring the same way Evelyn once had. For a moment, the young woman looked ready to keep riding. Then slowly she turned her horse toward the ranch. Evelyn smiled softly to herself before setting the bowl aside. Behind her, the screen door opened and Cole stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The flowers bent gently beneath the Wyoming wind. And somewhere beyond the fence line, new seeds were already finding ground. Maybe that's what this story was really about all along. Not the ranch, not the storms, not even the flowers themselves. Maybe it was about what happens when a tired heart finally finds a place safe enough to rest. Because if you think about it, most people spend their whole lives riding through one kind of wilderness or another. Sometimes it's grief, sometimes loneliness. Sometimes it's the fear that if you let yourself love someone deeply, you might lose everything all over again. And maybe you know that feeling yourself. Maybe you've had a moment where you almost kept riding, almost closed the door, almost decided the risk was too high. But Evelyn stopped, and Cole kept planting beautiful things in hard ground, long after he had every reason not to. That's the part that stays with me, the quiet kind of love. The kind built in kitchens, beside fences, through long winters and ordinary mornings. The kind that doesn't save your life all at once, but slowly gives it back to you piece by piece. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you'd like to spend a little more time out here beneath these Wyoming skies, with more stories about love, loss, second chances, and the people who find their way home when they least expect it, stay a while. There are still more trails ahead of us.